Thank you, and thanks very much to Grant for the invitation to speak today. The first thing that I will say is that the brains behind all the fancy analyses that I'll show are the other three people on that list there. And two of them are in the room. Andrea and Alessandro are here with us today, so I'm looking forward to some of these discussions in the afternoon. So I've been tasked to talk about woodland expansion in the context of climate change within the park, and I'll give you a summary of the work that we've been doing with the Park Authority. So the first slide to set a bit of the scene. You've heard a lot of this, so it allows me to flick through slightly quicker. We have Scotland's Forestry Strategy sitting above us, and we have various climate change commitments from the Scottish Government, many of which we heard from Rosanna earlier this morning. And a key issue in the Forestry Strategy and elsewhere is integration of woodland expansion to maximise benefits. So that's something I will touch upon. We have a range of expansion targets within the Forestry Strategy between 10,000 hectares per year increase in woodland, currently sitting at 12,000 and rising to 15,000 by 2025. We also have the Government's Programme for Scotland, which came out last year. And again, this is stressing very much what Scotland can do to try and end its contribution to global climate change by 2045, which is, of course, one of the rationales for having this conference today. And we also have more recently the UK Committee on Climate Change report. That was fantastic information, Chris, thank you. And there we see some considerations for the possibility of increasing the rate of woodland expansion targets, but sitting very firmly in the context of also ramping up peatland restoration, encouraging more low-carbon farming, etc. So we're thinking about woodland expansion in that broader context of integrating with other land uses. So setting that into the context of the park, so in discussion with staff at the Park Authority, what they're wanting to do is to consider the national woodland targets in the context of the park, and we've proposed three main steps for this to be done, and that's what I'll give you a bit of detail on today. So first is the most obvious question, if you like, is how do you apportion national targets to your area of land? Do you just divide it? If Cairngorms National Park represents 6% of the land area of Scotland, do they take on 6% of the expansion target? What we have proposed is actually something a little bit different from that, because otherwise you get this strange situation where you may give the same percentage expansion target for woodland in Shetland compared with woodland in North East Scotland or something like that. So all parts of the country have different capacity for woodland expansion. So I'll show you how we are calculating something that we call here the available land area as opposed to the total land area. The second main step is thinking about the locations of those new woodlands within the park to maximise benefits and also minimise disbenefits. And the third main step here is then taking those national expansion targets, taking some hypothetical higher expansion targets, because we know that might happen, and mapping them along with where they may have greater or lesser benefits or disbenefits, and using those to aid decision making. So that's basically what we've been doing. All of this sits within the context of the National Park's own forest strategy. Let me show you two maps from there and make you two key points before we move on. So there's a lot of green on this map. The dark green represents the existing woodlands, but all the other shades of green represent what we consider to be a good ecological potential for woodland and scrub. So the first point here, there is a high potential for expanding woodland and scrub within the Cairngorms. But the second point is that we also have an awful lot of other land uses within the park to balance out. So now you can see that there's various blue colours have appeared on the map, and the dark blue is the area which the Park Authority have already identified as their preferred locations to work within to meet the national Scotland targets. So let's have a look now. I'm going to give you a few slides on each of those steps and outline what we've been doing. So apportioning the national expansion targets to the total area of land available for woodland expansion. Let me tell you how I've calculated this. So basically what we've been doing is removing what you can define as non-available land. So if you look at the first bit, the biophysical here, first of all, areas that are too exposed and are considered unsuitable for tree and scrub growth, they get removed right at the beginning. Secondly, in fact, you'll see things that are written in brackets. You can see dams windiness score. So in brackets after every criteria that we've chosen, is a little bit of information about the data source. So if you want to know anything more about any of these, come and ask us afterwards, because I won't go into detail on those if you have the time. So B there, built up areas and water, they're also removed as non-available for woodland. And C, existing woodland, is also removed because it already has woodland on it. So you take away all of that land. Then there are two very important policy-related reasons for saying that large areas of land are also considered non-available, and these two here are areas of peatland where you would get a net carbon loss if you put trees there, and also in many areas they wouldn't even grow very well. And the second one is prime agricultural land. So we've called those policy-related because there are strong policies to protect those two land use types. So then basically you remove all of that and you consider the remaining land as available for woodland expansion. So we did that for the whole of Scotland, and we've also done that for the park. So the next slide will show you a map of what that end result looks like in terms of the land left available once you've removed all of those things. So basically everything that is coloured in brown or green is land that we are now classing as non-available for woodland expansion within the park. So the brown is all of those things I listed, the green is included in there, and that's the existing areas of woodland. So they'll appear on every map that I'll show. So interestingly enough, to give you a kind of ballpark figure, that represents about half of the total land area of the park that we are taking out at step one as not available, either biophysical or policy reasons, for woodland expansion. So you've got about 50% of the park left. So then, if we continue this step one aim, translating that into actual numbers, hectareage. So we've got total area of available land for woodland expansion for the whole of Scotland. We have total area of available land within the Cairngorms National Park. You then take the Scotland level woodland expansion targets. You literally just translate each expansion target of hectares into a proportion of the available land in the whole of Scotland. You then apply that same percentage to the Cairngorms National Park available land, and you get your translation into hectares within the park. So then you're calculating the corresponding woodland expansion targets if the park want to match those national level targets. I'll show you a table for what that turns into. So what we have on here, a series of columns. On the left hand here, we have the Scotland annual target in hectares. So you heard myself and others talk about the current forest strategy being between 10,000 and 15,000 hectares per year expansion. We've also looked at 20, 25 and 30,000 in recognition of the likelihood of these targets increasing nationally, so we can actually have a look at what that means for the park. So this is when we've done all that translation that I talked to you about. This is the hectareage to make an equivalent increase within the park. So at 10,000 you're talking about 8,000 hectares increase in woodland cover per year. Take that across to the next column, and in fact all the next four columns are how it might look by 2045 if you take any of these targets. So if we carry on with the 10,000 target, we've got 800 odd hectares of increase per year. By 2045 that amounts to about 20,000 hectares of increase in the park. That is about 4.4% of the land area of the park. If you then add that to the area of existing woodland, you get a sum total of about 84,000 hectares of woodland by 2045. And then at the very far right hand side here, that amounts to 18.6 of the land area of the park, and that's the total land area of the park. So that just gives you a feel for what these different scenarios at national level translate into in terms of the park. So that's what we're using then for the subsequent analyses. You'll see there's little stars on these two numbers, and that's just to make the point that at the moment the Cairngorms Forest Strategy has a 5-year woodland expansion target of 5,000 hectares, which is 1,000 hectares per year. That sits right in the middle of this 10 and 15,000 national target, and considering we're at 12,000 hectares at the moment per year, the Cairngorms National Park at the moment are right on target to be the same as the national target for woodland expansion. So let's go on to step two. So we've looked at what we're needing to consider in terms of amount of expansion to match those national targets. But this is then all about how do you maximise additional benefits of where you might place that woodland within an area like the park. So you're selecting criteria which may be opportunities for additional benefits, or they may be constraints where you would get disbenefits, and have a look at how you can use those to help you prioritise where you put your woodlands. Now, we've used, for the exercise that we're doing at the moment with the park, 5 specific criteria, but I must stress these are very illustrative because there are many more that you could put in there, and every time you add or subtract a criterion, the end result will change, and I'll talk about that again. So these are the 5 that we've used. Every time I put one of these 5 up, a map will appear, and I'll talk about the map after I've outlined what we've got. So first on the list of where to put your woodland to get specific benefits, this is the one that's most talked about. So I've called it net carbon impact, which is basically if you put your trees on an area of land, what will be your net impact compared with what is there already. So this is a combination basically of the current carbon levels in soil and the potential carbon storage by trees, which is basically looking at how fast the trees will grow. So if you're wanting to have the biggest net carbon impact, you will look for areas where the soil carbon is currently lowest, and you will be looking for areas where the potential for tree growth is currently highest. And that's just if you're wanting to get this number as high as possible. So if you go across to the map here, for all of the maps that you'll see, basically dark brown is the biggest benefit according to what I've just explained to you on the left, and the yellow is the smallest benefit. So not surprisingly, if you look at the two factors we're using, the areas where you'll get the biggest net carbon gain for putting your woodland are all along the valleys, Speyside in particular, and you can see again over on the east side of the park. So if you were only wanting to do this, that would be where you'd get your fastest net carbon gain. Soil erosion risk. All the brown areas there are highlighting those steep slopes which are relatively unstable. So if you placed your new woodland in any areas of the coloured brown here, you should have the added benefit of reducing the risk of soil erosion, which again has knock-on effects lower down the catchments. River shading, another one that's been mentioned as particularly important for fish stocks. So the park asked if we would put a 50-metre buffer around the rivers, but what my colleagues have also done is add solar radiation estimates onto the top of that. So if you go over to this map, here's a little bit of river that's been expanded for you to see. Basically, any pixel that is dark brown there indicates that it's not only close to a river, but it has the highest solar radiation there. So if you want the maximum shading gain on your river systems, you'd be looking for where the sun is shining hottest at the moment. If you put trees there to shade those, you'll get the biggest net impact in terms of shading. The fourth one is what's called connectivity potential, and this is models which my colleagues have created, which are basically mapping out potential dispersal avenues between different areas of woodland. So again, anything that's dark brown on that map is the best considered dispersal avenue for woodland species to move between one existing patch of woodland and another. So if you want this to be your priority, you're aiming for those brown areas there. And the fifth and last that we've tested for this particular illustration is simple proximity to existing woodland. So you can see all the darker brown areas then are next to your existing woodlands. So you can put any number of criteria in here as long as you've got good spatial data, and then using something that's wonderfully called spatial multi-criteria analysis, you can basically combine scores for all of those selected criteria that you've put into your model, and you can come out with a map like this, which is a simple average scoring for all of those available locations across the park according to how well they meet those combination of 5 criteria that I just listed to you. So anything that is dark brown on that park has the best overall benefit according to just those 5 criteria. Things to note, at the moment this analysis everything's weighted the same, but if you decided you wanted to weight your sediment retention more highly, you can do that, and then you would rerun the model and the brown would move. And the second point that I made to you before, and I'll keep stressing throughout, is that the outcome is completely dependent on the choice of criteria. So you take one of those 5 away and those brown areas will move. You weight one of those 5, the brown areas will move. You add another criterion in that's not in there at the moment, those brown areas will move. So this is utterly dependent upon the criteria that you're putting in. So then on top of that, you can add what we're calling soft constraints, which allow very easy consideration of other things you might want to think about in terms of where you're expanding your woodland. So examples would be areas that are important for waders, areas that are designated for perhaps for open ground, recreation areas, other farmland that wasn't in that prime agricultural land earlier on, and so on. Now I've coloured the waders one in green because you will not be able to see it at the back of the room with the size of the screen. There are areas of hatching here and here and here where the land has been defined as being particularly important for waders. So as a simple step of overlaying some of these data sets on your brown and yellow map, you can, if you like, foresee where you might have the biggest likelihood of conflict with any other kind of designation or land use, and you can then make decisions accordingly. If it's a really important land use, you can then put it into the model and make sure that that land isn't included for your woodland expansion plan. So the third step then is basically taking your targets translated to the park, taking your multiple benefits analyses that I just showed you, and having a look at where you might then prioritise those particular woodland expansion targets according to the best multifunctional score. So here I've just taken a map which is the second scenario from the table, which is a 15,000 hectare per year national target. So this is higher than the current national target, but we know we're heading towards it. So basically everything that's coloured in blue there represents where you would have expanded your woodland by 2045, so that's every single annual target up to 2045, all put on the map as a whole. What it's doing is picking the parcels of land that best fit those 5 criteria that I showed you. So there's the 15,000 hectare scenario. What we have on the next slide is basically rolling between all 5 of those expansion scenarios that I showed you so that you can get a visual for what this looks like across the park. So here we have none, 10,000, 15,000, 20, 25 and 30. So I'll let it roll a little bit. It's a really, really powerful tool for actually visualising what the reality of these different national targets might look like within the park. But as I say, it's just based on those 5 criteria, so it's just an illustrative analysis of what you can do here. Let it run through once more, and I shall move on to my last slide. So I think this kind of thing's great, but as I say, that's all my colleagues, not me. Okay, so let's summarise my main messages. So the first question that a lot of people ask is, what will be the impacts of the national woodland expansion targets to the park? And I hope I've given you an illustration of what those impacts might be in terms of visually, if nothing else. So the first point I want to make is that even at the current annual targets and even at the proposed higher annual targets, we're talking about a very small total expansion of woodland area within the park. So at the moment, you'll be adding on an extra 5% land area of woodland by 2045. So connecting to that, we also saw about half the park is theoretically available for woodland expansion in terms of biophysical policies. So that actually gives an awful lot of location choice, which is great, and it also gives a lot of opportunity to integrate with and also protect other land uses. So that's good news for the park in that you've got a lot of capacity to make your decisions about which land uses have priority and how you will allocate your woodland expansion to have the maximum benefits, added benefits, across the park. So spatial multi-criteria analysis is a really powerful tool, as I hope you saw here. It allows you to assess the relative benefits and costs of locating woodlands in different places. You can put in any criteria at all that have got spatial data. You can use weighting, which we didn't do here today. You can add and remove and change any of those criteria, and you can rerun the model to make new maps. And I'm going to give you a little example of that going back to the waders here. So I have just extracted a tiny bit up towards Speybridge from the 20,000 hectares per year target. So that's a lot higher than our current national target. And some of you might be able to see this hatching, which is the areas that have been identified as important for waders. So it's only when you get to 20,000 hectare national target expansion that you start to see a big potential conflict of the best land for expanding your woodland and the best land for waders. So this area in here, you see the blue overlaps the hatching, or you may not see it, but I can tell you the blue overlaps the hatching there. So again, what this allows you to do is to say, well, okay, if we're thinking about wader land, where it's probably not desirable to have any major increases in tree cover, this is not going to be a major problem within the park until you get to a national expansion target of about 20,000 hectares. So my last point here, and a really important issue, as you see, I've stressed very much that the data you put in has an enormous effect on the end map. So it's really important, and this is something for this afternoon, to think very carefully about what opportunities and constraints are most important for the park. They may not be the same in all parts of the park, but this is the massive discussion that needs to be had. And also then connecting to that, how good the data are for any of those things that you think are important to consider. Because if we don't have good spatial data on them, it's going to be very difficult to get a good answer out of a mapping exercise like this. So thank you all for listening. I want to stress before I finish that the work you heard is actually part of a much bigger ongoing programme of research funded by the Scottish Government. So not only are my colleagues working at the Cairngorms National Park level, but they're also producing something very similar at the whole Scotland level, which is bringing in other criteria that I didn't speak about today. So again, if anybody wants to know more about that for other parts of Scotland, we have 2 of them here today. Please either catch them or feel free to email them afterwards. Thank you.